All right, so in my last video, I talked a little bit about the teenager worrying about everybody thinking they're cool, right? That sort of status quo bias that we ingrain into our children by constantly criticizing them during their adolescent years until they form a stable identity that no one could ever criticize them for. Um, yeah, I think it's bad. Part of that process is that there's always been sort of a binary of the cool kids and the not cool kids. And I don't think this has ever been more explicit than in like 80s movies about jocks versus nerds. I think they made that as explicit as you could have. And the jocks were the on top and the nerds were the on bottom. Now, I don't think I'd be the first person to point out that nerd culture has sort of taken over. The stuff that used to be nerdy, comic books, superheroes, Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of that stuff has become much more mainstream than it used to be. There are a lot more people involved in this. My mom and my nana play Settlers of Catan now. And the MCU in particular is huge. It's the biggest thing. Everybody watches it. It's the blockbuster every single time one of them comes out. It is taken over Hollywood completely. So now we're in a place where the kids who used to like bully me in high school are also huge fans of the MCU, and yet there's still this group of people who are like nerds, who are like not the cool kids, and they're like, "Oh, I'm such a nerd. I'm so not cool. I like superheroes. I like comic books. Everybody likes comic books. Everybody likes comic books now. What is this persecution complex you have?" And I say this as one of those people. I was kind of in the group without even doing any of this stuff. I remember I used to hang out with like the anime girls, with like the weebs, and they would talk about all the animes they watch. And that was like my clique, but I didn't watch a single one. I didn't watch a single anime. I didn't watch it at all. I just felt like that was my people because they were the underdogs, I guess. Um, yeah, and there's a Nietzschean thing going on here, okay? Philosophy nerd time. Friedrich Nietzsche had this theory about morality dating back to ancient Egypt, where the Egyptians, who were on top of society, they had their own morality, and the Hebrew slaves had their own morality as well. The Egyptian morality was basically it's cool to be hot and eat a lot and party and be Egyptian and be powerful and be strong and on top and awesome. Their, their morality was like, it's very cool and good to have all of the attributes that make someone happy and engage in debauchery and all this other stuff. And then the other morality, the Hebrew morality, was one day we're gonna die, and if we refuse to engage in any of this debauchery, we'll be rewarded with heaven. Meanwhile, all these other people who engage in this debauchery, they're gonna go to hell. So actually, we're the good guys. And it was sort of a self-serving narrative because they're slaves. They don't really have much of an opportunity to be greedy or lustful or slothful. Notice these are the 7 deadly sins. The 7 deadly sins are a bunch of things that any normal person thinks are fun and awesome and would like to do. And they're also things that slaves don't get a chance to do. And so they made up their own version of morality that had them on top, that said that they were secretly the morally pure people and they were going to be rewarded not in this life, because clearly the Egyptians were rewarded in this life. They were going to be rewarded in the afterlife. And that basically became Christianity. That is where Christianity and the moral code that has dominated our entire society for thousands of years comes from. It comes from a cope, basically. It comes from a sad cope. And so when it comes to high school life and the cool people versus the nerds, you can kind of do a Nietzschean analysis where the jocks are the Egyptians and the nerds are the Hebrews. And if you're doing what Friedrich Nietzsche said to do, then you want to be the Ubermensch. You want to be the nerd who realizes that his morality, his moral code about how, oh, I'm the underdog. I'm so, I'm cooler actually secretly because I'm smart, and all those jocks are just a bunch of dumb lugs. You know, you have to realize that that's a cope. You have to realize that that's a morality, and you have to rise above that morality and join the ranks of the elite. Start to value the things that they value. In other words, you need to stop being a nerd and become a jock consciously. Embrace their system of values and do everything you can to rise above it, because you know that your station is being held onto by this ideology. So, how do you do that? I think for me, part of it has been just maturing and realizing that not everybody who likes sports is like a brickhead, and playing sports is actually very good. You should play sports. Playing sports helps you lose weight. It keeps you healthy. It's probably fun. I bet people who play sports have more energy. I bet they're smarter. I bet they're smarter because they get that exercise in, and then it gets the brain juices flowing, and the adrenaline gets everything working. And meanwhile, you sit around being a nerd and playing video games and eating a bunch of junk food, and you think you're smarter, but your brain isn't getting the calories it needs. So, probably a bad idea to completely reject the concept of fitness and a good sense of fashion while you're at it. But now there's this weird thing on top of that, right? So on top of the you shouldn't identify with the nerd group, you should try to kind of become the Ubermensch, you should try to become the jock anyways. On top of that, there's this weird shift where what was nerd culture has become cool culture. And so I'm not sure that even the underdogs know who to be anymore. Who is the underdog? Because everybody likes the MCU. So what makes you the underdog in the modern day? So I'm proposing an alternative category of nerdiness. To be clear, while I do think you should try to embrace aspects of the morality of the jocks in order to make your life better, I don't think you should reject the nerdiness. I think the Ubermensch just takes what they want from both and does whatever they please. The Ubermensch is High School Musical. You know that one song from High School Musical? You do. Stick to the status quo, where the sports kid is like, I wanna make baked goods. And everybody's like, shut up. You do sports. You don't make baked goods. And then at the end of the movie, he makes baked goods and he does sports. Do that. Do that. That's the thing you do. In addition to that, I would like to propose, to help culture out a little bit, a new category of nerds. The new underdogs, if you will. The new kind of types of nerd culture I've seen emerging. Because nerd culture isn't a static thing. It's not gonna be Dungeons and Dragons and comic books for the rest of time. And I think we've convinced ourselves that there's something almost genetic about Dungeons and Dragons and comic books, that it just is a nerd thing. So I'm gonna propose some new nerdy things that people have started to take an interest in that are the new nerd culture, all right? Speculative biology. Okay, this is cool. Okay, this is a lot of video games do this. Rain World does this. No Man's Sky does this. Creature designers. I went to school for game design. Creature designers do this. It's where you take the actual scientific principles of biology and you apply them rigorously to the design of non-existent fantasy creatures that could hypothetically exist either in some magic world or some sci-fi world. So you take the coming up with new, cool creatures and monsters that has always been kind of a part of fictional writing, and you get really depthful and scientifically accurate about it. And you're like, well, this guy lives in a water environment, so he has to have fins, he has to have gills, he needs to be shaped, hydrodynamically. And you kind of criticize one another's little characters, right? You're like, well, that guy, he's not designed right for this environment. He's not hydrodynamic enough. He's not going to fit into this water environment. So that's a whole new type of nerdy that I think should be part of the new nerds, all right? Then there's alternative history nerds. This has been a huge thing. It's adjacent to my weird political shit, but I'm not into it myself, where people will be like, well, what would happen if Richard Nixon never won the American election? What would have happened then without Watergate? What would have happened to American politics? What would happen if the Nazis won World War II? And they take a starting point, but then they add the depth of a historian's knowledge. It takes a real knowledge of history to do these alt history scenarios in a way that is cool and exciting and helps people nerd out about it. So I think that's a new one. All right. Next one, liminal spaces. All right, all the back rooms people. This is the Gen Alpha stuff, right? They're starting to get into the back rooms. They're starting to get into abandoned malls and urbex. Urbex is just where it's basically trespassing. You just go into abandoned buildings and you just hang out in abandoned buildings, but it's cooler now because it's called urbex. It's urban exploration. I just got that. It's urban exploration. It's just an abbreviation of it. Urbex. So that is the next thing, liminal spaces, right? And that kind of ties into like ARGs, which I'll get to in a minute, and other like horror content, analog horror content. Funguses. That's a thing now. Fungus nerds, right? There's always been like kind of trippy stoner people, right? If you can make mushrooms, make music, and then post about that on the internet, mushroom music, that's a new nerd. That's a type of nerd now. I've decided that that's a nerd thing. MLMs and scam debunkers, okay? So these are people who their obsession is learning the detailed stories of scams, like the blood lady, the Theranos blood lady from the movie. I'm Theranos from the movie Theranos. She's like a scammer, and everybody learned the details about it. Or Firefest, right? Anybody who talks about Firefest, there's like this weird like clique. There's like this weird little inside clique, and for some reason a lot of them are liberal. I don't know why that's a thing, but there's like a liberal subgroup of nerds who really, really care about Firefest, and they know everything about Firefest. This is a new type of nerd. And I've categorized them now. So now you can recognize them in the wild. Instead of just being a thing that kind of spontaneously exists, now you can go, oh, that's the thing you're into. Because sometimes I feel like there's a lot of people these days who don't know how to describe their interests because they're spending 24 hours a day watching 3D generated backrooms content, and there's not a word for that, the way that there is a word for like, oh, I'm kind of a nerd. I like reading comic books a lot. Right? But now we have a category. Now we can put a name to it. We can go, oh, you're like an MLM debunker. Okay, yeah, I'm into that a little bit myself. Ciao. Conspiracy skeptics. Okay, this is very similar. It's along the same lines. They debunk conspiracy theories, right? So they look into all of the details of the JFK assassination or Roswell or all these other conspiracy things, and they really depthfully look at it, and they debunk all of the different stuff about the conspiracies. I've engaged with this kind of content a little bit myself. It's okay. It's kind of fun. I don't know. It's not super interesting to me a lot of the time, but sometimes it can be fun. Indie games / game analysis. So this is a new one because games are new, right? Games are a new culture. We're still kind of a lot of people, for some reason, I don't know how it's possible that people still make this argument, a lot of people are still really clinging to the idea that video games cannot be a real work of art. Video games cannot have a real depthful message. They're not an art form, they're a game. It's completely different. I think that's been made very clearly not true. Not even going to list games right now. Just all of them. All of them have proven that video games are a real art form. But because it's so new, there is kind of an emerging subculture. I mean, obviously there's gamers, which is why there's been gamers for a while now. But I'm specifying this new scene of indie games specifically because I feel like there's a subcategory in there. The YouTube channel Get Indie Gaming, great example of this subcategory of people who pay attention to all of the little new creative indie games that come out and all of the game mechanics. I think there's a lot of game mechanic analysis. I know about this from the back end because this was my interest and this was why I went to school for game design. Aesthetic influencers. Okay, so aesthetics, right? Even the concept of aesthetics. Like, obviously it's been around for a while, but I feel like Gen Z and Gen Alpha, we're using the word aesthetic a lot more than we used to, and we're naming them. We're finding very specific like types of aesthetics, and I've even seen this crossover with political stuff because I've seen aesthetic compasses based on political compasses where they have different quadrants. There's like a campy and a chic or whatever, and then there's like you can like go from campy to chic, and on the x-axis there's like fun versus depressing, right? And then there's all the different names of all the different types of fashion within that XY spectrum. So people have started to plot and graph aesthetic cultures and name them. This is where like vaporwave stuff comes in, or Frutiger Arrow. Well, what's the deal with Frutiger Arrow? Well, why is TikTok unendingly suggesting me Frutiger Arrow related stuff? Next is furries. I love them. I'm a furry. Furries are awesome. They dress as animals, and I feel like they're probably the bottom of the pyramid culturally, because apparently the youth have turned against cosplayers. We just made it cool. We literally, it was lame for all of history. Everybody who grew up like 80s and 90s, it was lame. And then we just made it cool. And the second we made it cool, they subverted the subversion and made it lame again. They took it right back to being lame. They decided it was cringe right after we made it. We had like 5 minutes where everybody in the world agreed that sexy girls in Wonder Woman costumes is just objectively a fun thing that we should all enjoy together. I didn't know I was so passionate about that until I started talking about it. And furries are kind of beneath that on the pyramid because they're not, I think it's probably because they're not like recognizable characters. I think that more people can relate to wanting to see Leia in that golden bikini than they can to wanting to see a wolf girl in a bikini. Obviously, I want to see the wolf girl, but I'm not everybody. VR enthusiasts. This is another one. I watched this channel called Thrill Seeker, and there's a whole group of people who are like, either they're in VR chat and they use VR chat, or they're just tracking the industry, because there's actually a lot of cool industry news about the details of VR and how it's progressing and playing out, because it's at this like seminal point where everything is gonna change about the VR industry in the next 10 years. And so there are people who are watching every single development and nerding out about every single progression in the technology and trying on the different headsets. And it's not mainstream enough yet that everybody has a VR headset. So they're still right in that sweet spot where there's something to nerd out about, but it's not something everybody's on yet. Advanced board games enthusiasts. I've been trying to get into this one myself. German-style board games, Euro games, games with 50 million different cards, anything that is a couple of steps up from the Scrabble and the Monopoly that everybody has in their house. This is a new type of nerd. I mean, again, it's kind of always been around to a degree, but it's taken off. They're in Walmart now. You can buy Catan at Walmart now. I don't think that was always the case. I think that was a cultural shift that happened, where now there are, exploding kittens decks at every local bar. I think that's a big explosion in this subculture of indie tabletop games that has probably been brought on by the internet and the freedom and availability of people designing their own games and distributing them at a lower cost, at a lower overhead than ever before. And then the next one is ARGs. This is the last one. ARGs. This relates to the analog horror content. Whew, I'm out of breath. I watched recently a YouTube series by this guy. NightMind is the name of the YouTuber. Again, I'll put it all in the description. NightMind. He had a series of videos on this horror thing called Welcome Home. And Welcome Home is weird because it's a website. It's not a video series or a movie or anything like that. It's a website. But you click around in it and you get a story from it. And it's a haunted website. But it's a haunted website pretending to be a website about a bunch of curators at a museum of some kind who want to maintain this history. Oh, Jesus. Archivistry. That wasn't on the list, but that's another one. Archivistry nerds, because this plays off of archivistry nerds, people who look for an anime that they saw on a TV screen once in 1982 and it was super unpopular and they had it at their local VHS store and they've been looking for it for 40 years and they finally found it and now they're gonna download it into the Internet Archive so that it doesn't get lost to history, even though it wasn't a big hit. People who attempt to preserve cultural artifacts in this way. That's become its own huge online nerdy subculture. And I think it's, again, because of the internet, people can collaborate on this more. You can post now. You can post like, hey, I found this VHS tape from 1982. Does anybody know what it is? Oh, well, it looks a little bit like this. No, it's not that. That couldn't possibly be it. Because that's what they do. They yell at each other. So anyways, this ARG Welcome Home is about, it's pretending to be a website by a group of this other alt-nerd subculture of archivists, and they're archiving a puppet show, like Jim Henson Muppets style puppet show. And they're trying to do this puppet show, but it's a haunted puppet show. And whatever's haunted in the puppet show comes into the website. And then the YouTuber that's reviewing it, he pretends that it starts to take over him too. So now it's infecting the YouTuber himself, making the content, summarizing the website. So there's all these meta layers. And this kind of content where you're not just like watching a movie, you're like going through this interactive, collaborative series of layers of meta-analysis on a website that is accessible to everybody and anybody can click through it themselves if they want to. That is a new thing that's happening. And that is often called ARGs. ARGs mean a bunch of different things. As a game designer, it used to be annoying because AR can mean augmented reality. That's like Pokemon Go. You walk around in the real world in real time and you aim your phone at stuff and there's like a little Pokemon floating in your phone. That's an ARG. But another type of ARG is when somebody posts like a puzzle, like find this treasure in the real world, and they leave clues in hidden messages, and they post those hidden messages so that millions of people can collaborate on them all at once, and they make the puzzle hard enough that even with millions of minds on it, hopefully it takes people some time to solve it. That's also an ARG. There are two different types of ARGs. If you want to learn about ARGs, I suggest internet historian Cicada 3000. Anything about the game Cicada 3000, which was a game that either was or was pretending to be a recruitment for spies that tested your abilities to solve puzzles. Whew. So I think you've noticed probably a lot of the interconnected trends in this, right? It's this force of internet allowing people to come together in ways they never were able to before and to push back against the status quo biases. And so we've got this Ubermensch thing where you're forging your own path on your own against the grain of the status quo. And that is the new nerd culture, but it's also the embrace of the jock culture. It's all of it at once. And all of that happening at once is what Gen Z is doing without saying it. They're not saying it, they're not talking about it, they don't have to, it's happening. They are forging a path against the original nerd jock divide while creating their own new offshoots of nerdy subcultures that you can engage in freely. Goodbye.